Good evening. I am Karen Taylor. I am Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'd like to welcome both our in-person audience and, of course, our online audience to this evening's talk. This is the last lecture of the summer season. Though I hasten to add that we will be back in September with a new fall series of lectures. And I also want to say a special thanks to our in-person audience for coming out on what is a muggy, wet July evening. So thank you so much, very much appreciated. The General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the City of New York, and today our 238-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our various cultural and educational programs. These include the John M. Mossman Lock Museum, which you are welcome to visit after tonight's talk. The General Society Library, of which, of course, we are standing in this evening. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which, of course, tonight's lecture is part of. Tonight, for the conclusion of the summer series, we have a very special program, Sky High, a critique of NYC's super towers from top to bottom, with writer Eric P. Nash and photographer Bruce Katz. The talk is based on their wonderful books, Sky High, which we just happen to have for sale this evening. And I'm sure we have Lisa here from Books on Call, and she will be very happy to help you purchase a copy of this book. And I'm sure that Eric and Bruce would be happy to sign it for you. For our online audience, it is available online through the Princeton Architectural Press and Chronicle Books website. I would also like to express our appreciation to Chronicle Books for their help in promoting this event. It's now my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Eric P. Nash was a researcher and writer for the New York Times for 25 years. He's the author of a number of books about architecture and design, including Manhattan Skyscrapers, MIMO, Miami Modern Revealed, and a book he also discussed here last year, New York Art Deco, Birds, Beasts, and Blooms. Also, New York's 50 Best Skyscrapers, and as well as an architectural tour guide of New York City. Bruce Katz is an architectural photographer whose work has appeared in Architectural Digest, New York Magazine, Landscape Architecture, and the Washington Post. He's on the faculty of the International Center of Photography, and several of his images were recently acquired by the New York Historical Society. I want to give a very warm welcome to both speakers. Eric will begin tonight's presentation.
Good evening. I'm Eric Nash, and I'd like to thank you all for braving the elements. The images will be handled by my photographer, Bruce Katz, and I'll give you sort of a rundown of the book. There is a tendency among the public to dismiss all supertalls out of hand, especially those on Billionaires Row, because they are the playground of the super rich, or simply because no building should be that tall. If you're interested in the sometimes shadowy financing behind these towers, there is an excellent new book out, Billionaires Row, Tycoons, High Rollers, and the Epic Race to Build the World's Most Exclusive Skyscrapers by Catherine Clark of the Wall Street Journal. We would like to take a look at supertalls more from an architectural point of view. First, let me say that not all supertalls are created alike. As the poet Wallace Stevens said, that there are 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, let me suggest that there are at least 5 ways of looking at a supertall. How it affects the skyline as an aesthetic object. Here we have Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill's 1,550-foot tall Central Park Tower on the left, and Christian de Portzamparc's hooded 1,004-foot tall 157 on the right. You can also look at the way the building meets the street, like KPF's massive 1,401-foot tall 1 Vanderbilt, right next to Grand Central Terminal. And you can look at it both contextually and functionally, how it advances the by now more than a century-old evolution of the skyscraper. A couple of things get lost in the discussion when critics claim that supertalls dominate the skyline. For one, it is relatively rare to find a vantage point where you can see the full sweep of the building. Here, of course, is the oldest supertall in our book, Skidmore, Owing, and Merrill's 1,776-foot tall One World Trade Center, built in 2014, and SOM's 1,009-foot 35 Hudson Yards, seen from the western edge of the yards. Instead, supertalls are usually seen only partially, which softens the impact of their height. Another reason supertalls do not take over the city skyline is their sheer slenderness. Unlike the previous generation of skyscrapers, supertalls simply do not take up much of the sky. When Christian de Portzamparc went up 157, when his 157 went up on Billionaires Row in 2014, protesters marched with unfurled umbrellas against the shadows it would cast, a fear that turned out to be unfounded. At most times of the year, the supertall shadows fall back on the city itself. Where the shadows do fall over the park, they are narrow and fast-moving compared with older, bulkier buildings. Another factor that caused public alarm was that the supertalls seemed to go up overnight without any warning. In fact, the developer of 157 had been working behind the scenes for a decade to cobble together the air rights. All the supertalls in the book have been built according to a provision in the zoning code called AOR, or as of right, whereby the developer buys up the air rights of surrounding buildings in order to build tall. If an adjoining building has not used up the height to which it is entitled, the space is for sale, just like a piece of property. It's like a game of three-dimensional chess played with empty space. Central Park Tower bought up air rights from the Beaux-Arts mansion of the Arts Student League for $32 million and cantilevered out a section extending 30 feet to maximize park views. The money helped keep the venerable institution, founded in 1895, both intact and afloat financially. This being New York, people still complained. Let me say one thing in favor of supertalls. Although their sheer scale is so new, I think they usher in a new era of mindfulness in preserving existing architecture. No important buildings were demolished to build them, and some of the best ones, like Shop's Steinway Tower and their 9 DeKalb in Brooklyn, incorporate existing landmarks in their base. In order for supertalls to come into being, two factors were in play. The first was economic. While address has always been a status symbol, sheer height was not. Traditionally, the wealthy preferred a lot of floor space in their residences. A glimpse of the flower-bedecked meridian of Park Avenue was deemed sufficient. This changed in the new millennium when developers discovered that the super wealthy were willing to pay tens of millions for a 700 square foot cabin in the sky, as long as it had spectacular views. This image of 53 West 53 is a splendid example of the park and river views afforded by supertalls along Billionaires Row. It's difficult to put a price tag on this ever-changing panorama. The second factor is advances in engineering that allow you to build a super tall skyscraper on a plot of land no bigger than your backyard. Let's measure the dozen supertalls in our book according to the categories of contextualism and evolution of skyscraper design. Portson Park's 157 was the first supertall on Billionaires Row and drew the most ire because it was so new, so tall, and so blue. Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times was the most critical. The conceit is falling water. The effect, a heap of volumes, not liquid, but stolid, chinsily embellished, clad in acres of eyeshadow blue glass, offset by a pox of tinted panes, like age spots. The tower does not even attempt to be contextual with the masonry buildings that line West 57th Street like Carnegie Hall. Portson Park may have decided that this was a new typology of building for the city, so it did not need to look like anything else. Today, the building does not look so starkly new because other supertalls have arisen and adjacent infill buildings are going up that bring its height back down to the street. Quite possibly, future passers-by will not find it remarkable. The next Supertall to go up was Raphael Vignoli's elegant 1,397 foot tall 432 Park Avenue. One of my favorite Supertalls for a number of reasons, and a counter-argument to critics of Supertalls. In 432 Park, the form is the structure. The columns of steel-reinforced white Portland concrete, by the way, a common construction material rather than marble or costly stone used in luxury residences, are what hold the building up, attached by floor plates to a central concrete core. The building is a permutation of skyscraper evolution because it relates to the exterior skeleton of Eero Saarinen's Black Rock CBS Tower of 1961. Gone are the days of classic steel cage skyscraper construction, like in photos of the Empire State Building going up, when rivet gangs poised perilously on I-beams to weld the inner skeleton that supported the building. Not just supertalls, but even mid-rise buildings are typically built with an inner concrete core and concrete floor plates attached to an outer perimeter of concrete columns to maximize floor space. The circular inner core of 432 can be seen in double height open floor spaces placed every 12 stories. The open floors are an ingenious solution to an engineering problem known as vortex shedding. A vortex is formed on the sides of a building in the face of a head-on wind, which causes tall buildings to sway from side to side. All tall buildings sway. The challenge lies in controlling the degree of acceleration, which is the most perceptible aspect of sway. Vignoli solved the problem by allowing space for the wind to blow through his building. A circular core, rather than a square one, also reduces the degree of buffeting and vortex shedding. 432 works at all levels. Its footprint is a square only 93 feet on a side. At street level, it fits into the dainty shoe of a pocket park recessed from the sidewalk. Seen from mid-range, its perfect geometry draws it down to the scale of the city. On the skyline, it is a classical white pillar, a piece of minimalist sculpture like the original World Trade Towers. Shop's 1,428 foot 111 West 57th Street, commonly called the Steinway Tower, is something new on the skyline. Its proportions are 1:24, the equivalent of 2 school rulers stacked atop one another, making it the slenderest skyscraper on Earth. The Steinway succeeds at all levels. Its razor-thin crown is an eye-grabbing addition to the skyline, at the same time referencing the older setback skyscrapers like 30 Rockefeller Plaza. We couldn't photograph it for the book because of scaffolding, but at street level, it is a marvel of urban contextualism because it stands modestly behind Warren and Wetmore's Beaux-Arts showroom from 1925. The Steinway is an example of an engineering advance in cantilevering, or suspending a building from a base. The architects tunneled underneath the Steinway showroom and built the tower on an underground cantilever. The entrance to the tower is through an almost invisible, low, glass-faced structure next to the showroom, while the showroom itself is reserved for large luxury apartments. The showroom's facade features a larger-than-life sculpture or tympanum of Apollo with a lyre and his muse, one of the architectural treats of West 57th Street. Another arresting addition to the skyline south of Central Park that also works well at street level is Jean Nouvel's black glass and steel 1,050-foot tall 53 West 53. Nouvel solved the requirements of the 1916 setback code by using slanted setbacks rather than the traditional 90-degree setbacks to create a shard-like profile, an evolution of skyscraper history, reminiscent of renderings by early skyscraper visionary Hugh Ferris, who imagined a city of crystalline towers. The tower meshes almost invisibly at street level by providing 3 floors of new gallery space for the Museum of Modern Art. 53 West 53 is not exactly on Billionaires Row, but realtors like to extend the dimensions of a prestigious address, like the Flatiron District. The most recent addition to Billionaires Row, at least one more by iconoclastic architect Rem Koolhaas is on the drafting board, is also the tallest, Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill's 1,550-foot tall Central Park Tower. The partie, or overall design concept, is a little unimaginative, resembling 2 side-by-side cartons with flat roofs, but the tower benefits from its reflective skin, which makes it dematerialize against the sky, another factor overlooked by critics. Central Park Tower claims to be the tallest residential building in the Western Hemisphere, but that is a bit of a cheat because its base is the Nordstrom flagship store. Again, despite its height, Central Park Tower does not dominate the skyline because of its relative slenderness. Cohn-Peterson Fox's One Vanderbilt, next to Grand Central Terminal, is a different story. It's a big building, perhaps too big for its site, 67 stories, 1,401 feet tall, containing 1.8 million square feet of office space. It was part of Mayor de Blasio's pre-COVID bid to build up the Midtown Business District. Another Supertall is on the way, SOM's Project Commodore, where the Hyatt Hotel stands east of Grand Central. The Commodore faces a strong contextual challenge situated between Grand Central and the Chrysler, so it would be interesting to see what the final design looks like. Because of its bulk, the way the tower meets the street is problematic. There is little space to make it contextual with its grand dame of a neighbor, Grand Central. On the upside, the developers did provide a parklet, too narrow but well used, and an overhang that provides rain protection to commuters on the new Long Island Railroad station. Where this building succeeds best is in its slanted crown, a tribute to the decorative crowns of the Art Deco era. At night, the setbacks are playfully illuminated, like a gigantic ghost bicycle. The distinctive spire is about 400 feet taller than the Chrysler building, if not as phantasmagoric, and can be seen from many places in the city. So it has a good chance of going on to become a landmark, at least in the primary sense of the word, as a point in the distance by which you can orient yourself. Now let's look at the Supertalls in the two new complexes that have been added to the city, the World Trade Center and Hudson Yards. I think it makes sense to look at them as a composition, like our older complexes, Rockefeller Center and Lincoln Center, rather than just individual towers. Built in 2014, SOM's One World Trade Center, better known as the Freedom Tower, has become such an icon of New York City and the American spirit to rebuild after 9/11 that it seems petty to critique it. However, the symbolic height of 1776 feet as a reference to America's year of founding was achieved with an unadorned, disproportionate mast that takes up a full third of the tower's height. The tower is best viewed from afar, where you get a sense of its massive scale compared with other buildings downtown, or directly from its base, where you see the sweep of the building from top to bottom, and the mast is foreshortened. The tower's best effect is its glassy skin. The spandrels, or horizontal supports, are hidden behind the surface so that the tower appears to be sheathed in a single crystalline surface that interacts marvelously with the atmospherics at different times of day and with different moods of weather. Like Rockefeller Center, with its bonbon of an ice rink in the middle of Manhattan, the World Trade Center is an emotionally engaging, even entertaining public space. I was drawing you through a variety of experiences, from the uplifting Freedom Tower, the light-filled Cathedral of the Oculus by Santiago Calatrava, to the solemnity of the perpetually weeping cisterns of the Reflecting Absence Memorial in the footprints of the original towers, where people stand in hushed reverence as opposed to the tourist gaiety of the observation deck. The surrounding buildings, including Roger Stirk Harbor's mightily braced 1,079-foot tall 3 World Trade Center, do not intrude, but rather stand as guardians, along with the near Supertall 4 World Trade Center by Fumihiko Maki, which falls just short of the 300-meter mark at 298 meters or 978 feet. The buildings are content to stand as foils to the central star. Hudson Yards also has entertainment value, particularly the edge on Cone Peterson Fox's 1,270-foot tall 30 Hudson Yards, the highest outdoor viewing platform in the Western Hemisphere. But I think it fails as a public space on several counts. The yards raise the question of who owns public space. Unlike Rockefeller Center, which melds imperceptibly with the city grid, or the luxuriously landscaped Lincoln Center, which serves as a public park, the yards have a distinctly cloistered, anti-urban feel, a city apart. The complex is designed to be entered primarily from the number 7 subway train and from the High Line, which affords some measure of control over who uses it. On the street side, it presents a hostile, almost impenetrable wall that can only be entered through the building lobbies, a private, secure space. The yards are a highly controlled, semi-private space dedicated to consumerism. Sir Norman Foster said the real test of the yards is whether it makes for an interesting walk. And I would answer, no, it doesn't. The centerpiece public art, Thomas Heatherwick's Vessel, intended to be as much of a symbol of New York as the Statue of Liberty, is closed, and there is little to do or see except window shop for luxury items. The overlarge buildings contain lots of what Rem Koolhaas terms junk space, empty space leading to more empty space. Our book covers 3 of the 5 supertalls in Hudson Yards. 2 were topped off after our deadline. Bjarke Ingels' 1,031-foot spiral with its terraced zigzag facade that looks as if it were cut out with a giant pinking shears, and Foster's boxy, bulky, 1,011-foot tall 50 Hudson Yards, which contains a whopping 3 million square feet of commercial space, still waiting to be filled. SOM's 1,009-foot tall 35 Hudson Yards features residences beginning on the 53rd floor with limestone trim, just the kind of thing the wealthy like in their homes. The proportions and squared-off roof of the firm's slouchy 995-foot tall 1 Manhattan West fail to convey the sweep that a supertall should have. The complex had little master planning like Rockefeller Center and Lincoln Center, and in fact, the individual architects conferred only a few times. There is little synergy between the buildings and even less of a sense of landscaping or a central plaza. As a result, no matter how good the individual buildings are, the effect is of random pieces taken from different chess sets, down to the visored knight's helm of 30 Hudson Yards and the slanted bishop's mitre of KPF's 10 Hudson Yards. Even Stephen Ross, the primary developer, admits that the true success of the yards is the decking, the platform that transforms the rusting, unused train yards into some of the most valuable real estate in the world. The original plan was to build out the yards in 2 phases, covering what you see in the foreground, with an additional supertall. The serious slump in demand for office space as a result of remote work may have interfered with this. If so, I think the best solution would be to landscape the yards to incorporate the riverfront and make it more of a park-like public attraction. The last Supertall in our book is Shop Architects 9 DeKalb in downtown Brooklyn, which was still being built out at our deadline. A second Supertall is on the way, which is a good thing. Downtown Brooklyn can use some interesting architecture, having lain fallow as a parking lot for municipal buildings since the Robert Moses era. Shop pulled off another urbanistic coup by incorporating the Pantheon-like dime savings bank of 1908 as its lobby, much the way Shop preserved the Steinway showroom. The tower itself is perhaps less successful, standing in attenuated solitude on the Brooklyn horizon. Its shallow setbacks can be seen as a tribute to the Art Deco era, but the reason for its bronze coloration, perhaps more suited to a Sunbelt city, will probably be lost on the general public. It's meant as a reference to the coffered ceiling inside the bank's dome. An antiquated architectural treat are the columns decorated with oversized Liberty dimes instead of the FDR dimes we are familiar with. Because the president was still alive when the interior was redone in 1932. The question of whether supertalls are a sustainable typology is an open one, depending on myriad factors. Even though New York is home to the greatest number of billionaires in the world, 156 at last count, will the global economy sustain a supply of super wealthy people able to afford tenancy in supertalls? What is the future of work, and will remote work post-COVID outdate the need for large office space? Vacancy rates are soaring, as high as 20%, as the value of office real estate companies plummet. Ecological concerns are also part of the picture. The vast majority of supertalls are located in coastal cities at a time of climate change and rising sea levels. Manhattan, of course, is directly at sea level. One alarming statistic is that Lower Manhattan is actually sinking under the weight of its buildings. So, are Manhattan's supertalls a glimpse of the future or a snapshot of the city in time? For the moment at least, supertalls have altered the scale of the city, an effect that can only be appreciated from afar. A science fiction city of gigantic geometric minimalist sculptures, among which the familiar Art Deco spires stand like toys. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about really just some of the design ideas and thinking behind my photography as we worked on this book over a period of time. I want to start with just a little bit of background information about architectural photography in and of itself. And that is that there's conventions for the photography that are particular. It's architects present their work usually in renderings and blueprints in a very formal fashion. And architectural photography kind of follows those traditions. And the biggest thing about architectural photography is really something very simple, and that is looking at buildings, we like to keep the verticals vertical and the horizontals horizontal. I think we all know the experience of, particularly in this city, of looking up at any number of tall buildings, craning your neck, and watching the building kind of keystone as you look up, where parallel lines tend to converge. So keep that in mind, you know, as I'm going to show a few examples of my work in the book and how it relates to the story of these buildings and how they relate to the city. This first shot I really enjoy on a couple of levels. And one is that it gives you a sense of the proportions of these buildings on Billionaires Row. From right to left, you see one Central Park Tower. In the center behind Essex House is 157. Steinway is next, the super slim two rulers stacked on top of each other building that Eric has talked about. Next to that is 53 West 53rd, and in the distance is the crown of one Vanderbilt. It's kind of a family shot. One of the problems or one of the challenges of photographing these buildings is there's almost no place in the city that you're able, at least from the ground, to see the entire building. Getting a clean shot from street level to the top of the building and keeping the building in any kind of proportion where you get to sense the architecture as it was meant to be seen. Here you obviously see that you know, the trees obscure the base of the building, but to Eric's earlier point, you also see how these buildings are incredibly slim and actually take up very little proportion of the sky behind it. I know one of the big criticisms of these going up is that they were going to create a claustrophobic effect and really interfere with the beauty and sense of Central Park, with the shadows. And of course, Eric has mentioned that, when I started doing the book, I immediately thought, oh, I need to find this place to document these shadows crossing the park. And when I started scouting locations, what I found is that shadows don't fall in the park at all, except maybe once or twice during the year, just the way the sun runs. So it was never an issue. And here you can see, if you really wanted to, you could actually measure how much sky you see from the sheep meadow here. The other thing about this photo that I like is it screams New York. New Yorkers love Central Park. Here you have in the foreground, two folks doing yoga or Tai Chi, oblivious to everything else that's going around them. The lawn is beautiful. It's a lovely summer afternoon. And these new buildings are now part and parcel of the skyline. And it gives you a good sense of the proportion of the buildings and how it relates to people, which is an important part, how New Yorkers relate to the buildings. This is one Vanderbilt street level next to Grand Central. And photographically, I know we've seen this image earlier, but photographically, it was important because this building is one of the ones that you cannot see from bottom to top in one hero shot. And one of the important features of the building architecturally is how it relates to Grand Central and how it feels for the commuter on 42nd Street, arguably one of the busiest thoroughfares in the city. New Yorkers are kind of very pragmatic about how they approach things. I'm not sure a typical commuter coming out of Grand Central is thinking about architecture when they step out of Grand Central, but they certainly know how things feel, and they don't like walking out into what would be a rat's maze or a claustrophobic environment. And whether you like the architecture or not, the architects were able to maximize this open space and the pocket park nature of the space between Grand Central and one Vanderbilt. And as it just so happens, one of my commercial clients owns a building across the street, and they asked me to photograph this park as well because they're using it for their marketing, because it's a great place to relax and eat and be in the afternoon. You can grab a cup of coffee and it feels comfortable. So on a pragmatic level, it succeeds very well. On a photographic level, I chose to shoot this in the evening, early evening, so that you get a sense of what's inside the building and get some dynamism going on the street. I just hate seeing cars and buses parked on the street. It really detracts from looking at architecture and the buildings themselves. So my solution is to use a slow shutter speed and make them part of the energy of the city. Now we kind of flip the script here. This is the observation deck at the edge in Hudson Yards. And this was an opportunity photographically for me to work my inner street photographer instead of sticking to the rigors of architectural photography, and really just enjoy myself at the top of the observation deck. Now this observation deck, I think, is at 100 stories, and if memory serves, it's the highest outdoor observation deck in the Western Hemisphere. Or maybe not, I don't know. That's what they say. To me, the charm of this photograph is that, you know, you see the magnificent view, but the young woman in the foreground, her body language to me speaks volumes. You know, it was designed to be very open. This is not a place, if you have a fear of heights, you do not want to be here. And she clearly doesn't have a fear of heights, but she's not really ready to commit to leaning against the glass. You know, it's that, should I, shouldn't I, maybe? And again, it tells part of the story of the human interaction with these new supertalls. And I should also note that these observation decks are a financial windfall for the developers. I think, if memory serves, it's $50 a pop to get up there. You can stay for as long as you want, but they probably get between 300 and 500 people at a minimum a day. So you guys can do the math, and it's a lot of, you know, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of income daily from having this up there. This is another view of the observation deck. There is a kind of a theater and a second level. And here you really see, this to me feels like you need to take a cable car up there if you were in the Alps. I mean, it's that kind of, the buildings in the distance, Lower Manhattan and the One World Trade, feel like the mountains in the Alps, or, you know, if you go out to Palm Springs and take the cable car up, this is how it feels. And it's really, I really just have to say that this was fun. I mean, I could spend hours up here. And, you know, just watching the tourists, and the views are truly spectacular. You really get a perspective on the city that you didn't have before. I want to talk a little bit here about shooting what we call in the trade the hero shot of a building. And the hero shot is the ability to really encapsulate a building, its architecture, the feel, the design, how it relates to the city in one shot. And with One World Trade, it's so tall, it's so massive, that shooting it from anywhere nearby at the base will not give you a perspective that would fit with the architectural renderings or how the building looks. I think Eric mentioned before, you have to really step back to see this building in its environment. Now, of course, the building, the base is blocked. So this is one of the things where all the stars aligned for me in terms of photography, and having worked in the city for a long, long time. I started with cave drawings, in case you're wondering, and moved to digital. The buildings in the foreground are Brookfield Place, and it just so happened that they were an old client of mine. So in scouting locations for the book, or trying to get access to places to photograph these buildings, I was simply able to ask one of my existing clients whether I could spend the day on a setback on the 45th floor. It's about 6 feet wide, and on the 45th floor or so of the southernmost building. And the answer was yes, and I just happened to pick probably one of the best days of the year. So I ended up spending probably about 6 hours in total just hanging out on a setback in the open, 6 feet wide, watching the sun work its magic on the buildings. And here you can see that towards sunset, literally the golden glow of the sun as it's setting is bisecting the buildings. The shadows are falling perfectly. You can see the detail in the Memorial Plaza. You can see how the building relates to the rest of the city. And most importantly, you can see the architecture and the perspective of the building in proportions that make sense to the eye. Things aren't foreshortened. Then one of the things that we do as photographers, or that is we end up chasing light. And this is from the exact same position, I love working in what's called transitional light, that window of dusk from sunset. You have probably 20-25 minutes from when the sun goes down before it gets completely dark. And in that time, the lights in the building glow out, sky turns this lovely blue, and you really get a sense of these buildings as they look at night. And New York, of course, is a city that never sleeps. And we are looking at these buildings in the evening a lot. They become our beacons, as Eric said. We navigate by the Empire State Building lit up in, whatever flavor of the month. If you're a Mets fan, it's yellow and, orange and blue. But here, looking at the buildings in the evening gives you a very different feel for the buildings. The neighborhood feels different. You lose a little sense of the architecture, but you gain a sense of population in the city. The workers in their offices late in the evening. And you also see how the memorial is lit. Again, this is the exact same location earlier in the evening, and Eric has talked beautifully about this building, but here in terms of light, this is much earlier in the evening, and if you look at 4 World Trade, which is adjoins 3 World Trade, it's almost a perfect mirror, and you see the sunset reflected in there and the Hudson River in perfect and detail in the plaza and the buildings surrounding it, and you really get a sense of how the buildings relate to the city, which is really what we're going after in talking about these buildings in the book. And again, this is probably much later at night, and you're seeing into the buildings and the plaza in the evening. So this is the chasing light portion of our show. And here again, Eric has talked in detail about One Vanderbilt. The only thing I want to add to this is that from an architectural point of view, you know that the architects and lighting designers spent a lot of time figuring out how to illuminate the crown of this building to show it and transform it into its beacon. This image is really one of the things I enjoyed about this project is that I get to kind of zoom in and try and capture the details of the building. And again, this is just simply chasing light, beautiful late afternoon. And the stark contrast between the orange glow just accentuates the architectural design of the building. And it's just pretty. And the added benefit of this is if you look in the distance, in the center of the frame, that's 9 DeKalb rising in Brooklyn. And again, this is really the same thing, capturing beautiful light on the city. And really, this building, this particular shot, is the closest you can get to kind of understanding, as Eric said, is why you would spend so much money for, assuming you have it, for a view like this. I mean, who would not want to have cocktails looking out over the city in this space? I certainly do not have to worry about spending money on a place like this. If you look really carefully in the very right-hand edge of the frame, way up in northern Manhattan past the GW Bridge, is my little hovel of an apartment in northern Manhattan. One of the fun things about doing these details, again, is using light and accentuating the details of the architecture. And Eric has talked elegantly about it, but I'll just reiterate it here. You know, this building, this is One Central Park Tower, a detail of the top of the building. And it's basically disappearing in the sky. I know many of the critics initially would love to see the building disappear completely, but still from a photographic point of view, it really helps tell the story of the building and how it relates to its surroundings. Now, this particular shot is part of the history section of our book, but I wanted to include it for a couple of reasons. One is it's such an iconic building, and it's one of my favorite images. I just love the idea that you can create a kind of minimalist modern photograph of this iconic building by just showing a very small portion of it, and everyone knows what this building is. But deeper than that, one of the things that Eric had talked about is that this building, we've been living with it for 90 some odd years, and it's become an icon. And if you took a vote of New Yorkers or anybody, it would come up close to the top of people's favorite buildings in the city, certainly in skyscrapers. But one of the things that Eric had mentioned is that when this was first built, it was not universally acclaimed. It was called stunt architecture. And, you know, it was just an it was a stunt building just to advertise Chrysler automobiles or the business. And while, you know, we consider it an icon, and it's an anathema for us to think that, you know, somebody didn't like this when it was first built, but it goes to something that Eric had mentioned to me or writes about, and that's kind of the shock of the new. Everything that's new that's presented to you, one's initial reaction is, I don't like that. And it takes a little bit of time to get used to these buildings. So with that in mind, you know, when I was working on this project and talking to my friends about it, they say, oh, you're photographing all those pencil buildings. You know, everybody's, this new skyline, all of these buildings certainly are within 10 years. I have many pictures of the city that I've shot from a variety of buildings in which none of these buildings exist. You know, my archives, but my archives are not that old. So I think one of the things that I got really from Eric talking about these buildings, and it changed my thinking as I was photographing them and spending so much time looking at them, is that while not each and every one of them is going to be a classic building 50, 60 years from now, a couple of them will certainly have the potential to be well regarded and thought of the way we're thinking of the Chrysler building now. I certainly have my favorites. I think 53 West 53rd is my favorite out of all of them. But like it or not, we're living with these. And I think really the one thing that Eric had mentioned that I've taken to heart is that you really have to just live with them and kind of give them a chance before you write them off as pencils stuck in the ground. There's a lot of social baggage that goes with them, housing for billionaires, who's going to live there, that kind of thing. But they are part and parcel of our skyline. And, deserve at least a little bit of an open mind as you consider what we're presenting you. So I thank you very much for coming to see us.
Bruce, thank you so much. And indeed, Eric, those were just like so eloquent, thoughtful, provocative. Anyway, it was a fantastic presentation. I'll say a few more words at the end, but we will now take some questions from the in-person audience and the online audience, and we will start off with in person. Okay, I see a couple of questions at the back.
Thank you. Not so much the Supertalls, but many of the other new buildings are triangular on the tops, and it's become a fashion to have this. How do fashions like that spread? Like Twin Towers in New York, triangle top buildings. There are so many of them. I live near Waterline Square, so I see them every day. How does that work, and why do you think the triangle was the current favorite?
I just suspect that it has to do with accentuating the height of the building. Buildings with flat roofs don't look as sweeping. If you look at One Central Park, it doesn't seem as high as certainly the Steinway, which has the most jagged edge of any building. It may have gone back to the Citicorp building, which sort of reinvigorated the triangular roof. That's a good question.
There were some, yes.
Thank you very much for your presentations, but there is an issue which was not treated, which is very important to what a skyscraper is, which is that they are a vertical city and they have interiorities. They have entrance plazas, entrance passages. They have the organization of the office or apartment floors. And one would imagine that in apartments for billionaires, that the section line, for instance, in those apartments would be something that would maximize the vistas that they have. It's not just a series of windows. Equally, for instance, if you look at the Chrysler building, the crown of the Chrysler building was designed to have a certain special place to it, as also the entrance lobby. If you look at the Rockefeller Center, that place is a treasure trove of interiorities, spaces within the building, passage through the building, that make having an office there something special. So what would you have to say about the attention to detail in these buildings, the apartment buildings, the apartments that they're proposing to have in there? Are they just flat slabs like pieces of pizza, or do they have were they thought of? How much thought was put into how they would be designed by the interior people once they got their hands on it?
Yeah, I think less work was put in to the lobbies than in the older buildings. The priority seems to be on the view from the apartment, and that has to do with centralizing the core and pushing the columns out to the edges so that you get a maximum uninterrupted floor plate. But I think the days of the workmanship that went into the deco buildings like Rockefeller Center, they simply can't do that kind of work anymore. So it's kind of eluded over a little bit. You're right about that. Oh, yeah.
Right, the next question.
Some of these buildings have had negative press about malfunctioning elevators, water pipes breaking, they've litigation with the builders. It seems like they were too tall, too fast, Have these problems been overcome by the newer supertalls, or is this a chronic problem of all of these towers?
Well, I think you're mainly thinking of 432 Park, which had a whole series of lawsuits, but extremely wealthy people tend to be very litigious. So they just couldn't seem to find a way to get along. And I mentioned this novel by J.G. Ballard about a high-rise that devolves into class warfare, just like 432 Park did. They seem to lack a sense of cooperation as neighbors. And there were technical problems that weren't anticipated. Like, for instance, the garbage chutes in 432 just sounded like bombs going off because you were dropping garbage from so high. So, yeah, they didn't work everything out before they were built.
Thank you both. This is really fascinating. I mean, I don't like these buildings, but do you think that we're going to keep going up? Where is the tallest building? Is it Dubai or something? I mean, could there ever be a move to moderate and go back the other way?
At the moment, they seem extremely popular, especially in China. And once you can do something, you tend to keep on doing it. Like I said, there are certain economic limitations on this about who can afford them and whether they are sustainable. But as long as people are willing to pay for them, people will build them that high.
We have this is an online question. First of all, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. Just wondering, the photos are truly breathtaking, but I do wonder if you, Bruce, have even a slight aversion to heights, or if you are just as comfortable in challenging situations as on the ground. Better you than me.
Thankfully, I actually like being up high. I started my career many years ago as an aerial photographer. So my perspective, these buildings are, not 15,000 feet up. So I really enjoy being out on these setbacks or the roof of a building. It's a way of looking at the city that pretty much nobody else gets a chance to do unless you go to a place like the Edge. I don't have a fear of heights. I've moderated a few of the things that I do. Well, one of my clients wanted me to go up and shoot the views from the top of their building. It's one of the small residential buildings that's going up in Hudson Yards. It's only 55 stories. And the building's not yet complete, and they wanted me to climb 4 stories worth of 2x4 ladders, unlit, with no safety harness, and I do draw the line there. So we'll go back and do that when the elevators and stairs are working. So.
I wonder if either of you would like to comment on the fact that as a pedestrian in the area of Billionaires Row, for example, I find that wandering around the streets of New York, as I frequently do, that I am not impacted by these supertalls at all. That from street level, they are not very much different than any other building. And that the supertalls have a component which is way up in the air, which you are simply not aware of when you're close to them. You certainly see that very clearly in these elevated views, and you see it when you're in Central Park West. or you can see it in Central Park when you're viewing with, the city from afar. But when you're close to it, you're just not aware of the height of these buildings at all. And there are only a couple of them, in fact, that you become familiar with, because some of them literally do not meet the ground. Would you like to comment?
Bruce,
I agree completely with you. One of the things that we tried hard to do in this book is really talk about how the base of these buildings were, what do the buildings feel like, as a city resident, The biggest thing for me, particularly on Billionaires Row, is really the change in the dynamics of the neighborhood that has little to do with Supertalls per se, but it used to be West 57th used to have a much larger art component. Lee's Art Shop used to be there. I mean, I'd be down there working or, come down. I came down during the book. We'd have a regular meet up with friends on 55th Street, and I'd walk 57th Street and kind of, you don't see these buildings at all from the ground level, and it's really just the, what amounts to luxury retail. I mean, Central Park Towers is a 4-story Nordstrom's. So if you like shopping at Nordstrom's instead of Lee's Art Shop, that's really the difference in the tenor of the neighborhood that people see and feel on the street, rather than you can't see the top of Central Park Tower there. So the truth is the cyclists and e-bikes are far more deadly. I mean, in terms of practically walking around the streets, I mean, I think every New York pedestrian is now like looking 360 and wish they had personal radar. I mean, that's the reality on the streets that is far outweighs how we perceive these buildings.
Right, we'll just take a few more questions. I'm just going to, following up on what you were saying about the base of the building, this is a particular question about a base building of One World Trade Center. What do you think about the awkward way that the base of one WTC meets a street level with 18 stories of blast-proof material? And that's from Dwayne. Any comments?
Well, unfortunately, they really didn't have a choice for federal security reasons and so forth, because, the building was attacked twice. There was an earlier attempt where someone drove a U-Haul inside it and filled with manure or something, which was an explosive. So they had to make it bomb-proof. And I think they did that retroactively. They built it and then they reinforced it to make sure it was absolutely blast-proof. So it's an unfortunate aspect of the world we live in today.
Yes, and unfortunately, perhaps safety doesn't always come architecturally beautiful. Yeah. Right, I will just take this gentleman over there, I will take this lady, and then that will be it, because I also want, you can ask Bruce and Eric many questions, but of course they will be signing their book shortly, so I will ask if you will hold off the questions when we conclude this program after these 2 questions, and then you can join them at the book signing table.
The trouble for me with these buildings is that it just destroys the view shed from Central Park, and it's kind of ironic you were showing that, the yoga guys and gals and the great lawn there, or the grass and the buildings in the background. But before they went up, you knew the skyline was there, but you still felt like as if you were in the green womb of Central Park. and you didn't have to look at these big, ugly needle buildings. They didn't disrupt the skyline. It was a modest skyline. And, just as Olmsted intended, you could really get a feeling for being away from the city. And you just don't get that anymore. And you look at these big, ugly, needle, crass buildings, and it just ruins the view shed from Central Park. And it's really, I mean, I know this isn't on the list of our greatest problems these days, but it is a preservation value to consider. And, the planning dopes have dropped the ball. So there it is.
Okay, our last question.
Since these buildings are so new, have there been any serious issues of risk regarding the safety of living up so high in the sky in one of these buildings?
Not that I know of. They're very well engineered, and they've taken into account all things like sway and structural solidity. They're very well-made buildings, which I think is one of the more interesting aspects of them. It's really a new chapter in skyscraper design.
Well, Eric, thank you so much. Bruce, that was really fantastic. And obviously there are mixed feelings about the super high buildings, not just between you two, but in the audience. And thank you for answering those questions so well. But also, I think you really I'm a bigger fan of super high buildings after that talk, because those beautiful images and the explanation that you gave. So really, thank you both so much. But I think we'll all go away and perhaps look at those buildings with more attention. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to say a final few words, we have Victoria Dangle, our Executive Director.
Yes, thank you. And I'll be brief. Eric and Bruce, well, thank you. And as everyone knows, this is the General Society of Mechanics and Trades, and so I always like to say, without tradesmen, that no architects or engineers' vision would be possible. So I think of that often. So thank you to our tradesmen. But the other thing I really want to say is, I think we just had a group therapy session. Because I know, okay, I'm a native New Yorker. I know how I came in feeling about these buildings, but I'm happy to report that I'll think about it now. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
We just, a little memento of tonight. Victoria, if you wouldn't mind presenting these. The poster.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. And again, I want to remind you, the in-person audience, and indeed the online audience, that this wonderful book with these magnificent photographs and this thoughtful essay and text is available to purchase both in person tonight and anytime online through Princeton Architectural Press and Chronicle Books. We look forward to seeing you in the fall. Thank you so much for your support. Yeah. To our wonderful audience, thank you very much.